Do you ever get the feeling television isn't what it used to be?
So no.
Brexit means Brexit.
We had to take a compulsory course called Combat Propaganda.
Boris Johnson once declared that his life's ambition was to be king of the world.
Does Yevgeny Lebedev have any connection with the Russian spy machine? Well, yes.
Find deeply offensive. Where is the evidence?
I don't care if they find it offensive.
The fundamental problem with Facebook is that it is accountable to no one.
The government was advised to invest money in the NHS. The government aren't listening to the evidence.
The kind of world I want to bring my child into. Matharu, and over the next hour we'll bring you what the papers don't say
and what the TV doesn't tell you. Now tonight our show is devoted mainly to that question which is on a lot of our minds, is why is Boris Johnson given all that's happened ahead of the polls? And to do that we'll be talking to veteran political commentator and pollster Peter Kellner, the great commentator Femi, and having our own Sam Bright, chief reporter of investigations in politics, on the show. But first, to carry on like this, we need your support. We are not GB News. We don't have a hedge fund in Dubai looking after us. We're not Rupert Murdoch with monopolies all over the world. We are subservient to you. You fund us, you keep us honest, you comment on us. And if you do fund us, you get to comment on us directly on our Patreon blog, where, if you hang around, you can have questions and answers after dark when the show's closed, and we can tell you things we can't tell you live. And what you've got to do that is to go to patreon.com/Byline TV. That's patreon.com/Byline TV, and pay us a very little bit of money. So Hadi, it's going to be quite a simple show to start off with, because we're going to go first to the question on our mind, which is...
Yes, how does Boris Johnson keep maintaining his popularity? So it kind of follows on from what we looked at last week, which is how would you respond to a corrupted state if we were to say that the UK is in fact a corrupted state? And really what we've seen just in the week that's passed is this lobbying scandal growing even more significance. It's not now just centred on David Cameron, however. No. The questions are all coming back to Johnson, allegations of him, text messages between him and billionaire businessmen, looking at tax breaks and all sorts of things. Of course, as always, he said, well, I did everything I could and I'm not going to apologise for, procuring ventilators by sending my friend a text saying I'd do it during the coronavirus. So more bluster, more bluff. But it seems not to be impacting his popularity, and that's what we've got to explore. Why has he become the untouchable Prime Minister?
Well, for an answer to that question, who better to turn to than Peter Kellner? As I said, is a veteran commentator and journalist, been around for many decades, and one of the co-founders of YouGov. Earlier today, I asked him what is going on with the polls. So Peter, tell us what's happening in the polls and why Boris Johnson seems to, in spite of everything that's happening, rising in the polls.
Peter, if one takes the last 12 months, 12 months ago, April last year, Boris Johnson was riding high. Keir Starmer had just become leader of the Labour Party, but in the early stages of the pandemic, Boris Johnson goes to hospital, the public was sympathetic with him and thought the nation should pull together behind the government. Then we had that Dominic Cummings business of him going north to Byline Castle, County Durham, and the handling of the pandemic became widely criticised, and the government support, Boris Johnson's support, fell. And by the autumn, Labour was beginning to edge ahead. November, Labour had established a 4 or 5 point lead in the polls, and it's now gone back again. The latest polls indicate a Conservative lead of around 8 to 10 percentage points. We're back, not very different indeed from the results of the last general election, December before last. And I think it's quite clear what's happened is the rollout of the vaccines has gone very well. And this has also had the sort of secondary effect of knocking Brexit out of the news. So people think Brexit's done, we're through the transitional phase. They don't follow the stories about the difficulties of Brexit, but Brexit's sort of done and dusted. It's no longer a source of controversy as far as most voters are concerned. And that's where we are today.
So we've just been out in the streets in Uxbridge asking people about, some of the issues Byline Times has been covering and other organisations, The Guardian and the FT over Greensill, this accusation of cronyism among government giving contracts or lobbying among mates. Do you think that will have an impact or is beginning to have an impact as the vaccine success settles down or people don't really care about those kind of things?
Well, let's take what evidence we have so far. The polling so far has suggested no effect whatsoever. We had the latest YouGov poll come out just in the last few hours, and it shows a 10 points Conservative lead. And a couple of other polls this week have suggested very similar figures. So far, no effect. Will it have an effect? Now, this is where things get really interesting, because what history tells us is that sometimes these things fall completely flat, the public ignore them, and sometimes they get cut through and the government can suffer. And we had the Dominic Cummings event affair just under a year ago. That did cut through, that did move the dial in terms of the opinion polls and the ratings of the government and the Prime Minister. But go back, you and I will recall this, Peter, back in the early days of Tony Blair's premiership, when there was a bit of a scandal around some concessions he'd made privately to Bernie Ecclestone over Formula One racing and the display of tobacco manufacturers. And it looked pretty tacky. And he went on a sort of emergency television interview and said, I'm a plain sort of guy. He must have been worried. But, the polls didn't move a jot. Tony Blair was in his honeymoon phase. People were not willing or not ready to accept that he might be a wrong one. Now, had that same scandal erupted, say, 6 or 7 years later, after the Iraq War, after the shine had come off Tony Blair's reputation, it might well have done very much more damage. So, will the sleaze allegations have an effect? My guess is not yet, and it needs more things to come out. But if 3 or 4 quite separate and distinct things come out, which the public sees really are not on, then suddenly it might get cut through, but we're not there yet.
So can I use another analogy from our distant past, which is the summer of sleaze, and that likewise a Conservative leader had come in to replace before an election an elected leader, in this case John Major replacing Margaret Thatcher, went on to win, surprisingly, a general election, but then got dogged, didn't have much of a honeymoon, and had, if I recall, from sort of 1993 onward, cash for questions, this whole sleaze allegation, which is certainly an angle Keir Starmer has used in PMQs against Johnson.
Yeah, that's right. And that did contribute to John Major's downfall. But I would say two things about that, looking at what's going on today. The first is the government was already unpopular because of Black Wednesday crashing out of Europe's exchange rate mechanism. The details are lost in history, but it looked to the whole of the country that the government had based its whole economic policy on sticking with the European currency rates, and it then had to say, help, we can't do it. And its reputation for economic competence was destroyed in an afternoon. So after that, when you got these allegations, whether about sex, whether about money, whether about cash for questions, the public was receptive to things which were bad for John Major. And so I think today, that's an example from the mid-90s of things coming together in a way which really bore down on the government. And that's not really yet happened. One of the curious things is that the sex parts of the sleaze scandals from the mid-90s, the John Major era, they got widely covered. People chuckled at them, but they added to the feeling that John Major was a bit of a hypocrite on moral standard. He talked about back to basics. Well, Boris Johnson has been in more sexual hot water than any politician, British politician, I can recall. But he sort of shrugged it off. The rules on that, at least, don't seem to apply to him. So yet again, something which might have brought another Prime Minister down haven't brought him down.
One final question, Peter. We'd love to have a longer conversation with you in the studio. What extent from these focus groups that we've heard about to the Sunday Times, Tim Shipman, to what extent do, as well as accepting his sexual libertinism, let's put it that way, the voters kind of accept the cronyism? Just if people haven't read it, what Tim Shipman from these focus groups was hearing was that voters or potential voters were saying, well, we don't mind Boris Johnson's cronyism looking after his mates, as long as he comes to our constituency and looks after us. Is that potentially also a shift in morals and kind of ethics from the 90s?
I think there is a shift. And a part of that shift is that the reputation of politicians generally has taken a tumble. It kicked off with cash for questions. You had cash for questions some years ago. You then had the parliamentary MPs' expenses row, about 12, 13 years ago. And so if the public thinks, well, all the politicians are all alike, well, why would they change their votes if they think the other lot, in this case Labour, wouldn't be any better? So from Keir Starmer's point of view, what I think is he's got to establish is that if he were Prime Minister, he would clean things up. And he's not just going to say it, he's got to persuade people that he really will do it. And at the moment, I think the public are pretty sceptical about politicians of all stripes. And therefore, it doesn't particularly hurt or help one party when these issues come up.
Peter, excellent analysis. As always, we come away enlightened and informed. Thanks for coming on Byline TV, and let's speak again soon.
Peter, look forward to it.
Bye.
Well, Peter, what do you make of Peter Kellner's very interesting insights?
Well, great insights there. People despair about polls going up and down, but they go up and down. 2 points, I think, which really struck me, what he said. One was Boris Johnson was this far ahead last April because everybody rallied around during the pandemic. And then a Dominic Cummings story came along, Barnard Castle, that famous eye test, which we all very much appreciated, and his Rose Garden appearance. So who's in the news? Apparently on the front page of The Sun tonight, Dominic Cummings. And so that might dent his polls. I think
that's because, just very briefly,
yes,
Boris Johnson has said that all these text messages that have been released between him and the businessman James Dyson, he has accused Dominic Cummings of doing the leaks and trying to add to the cronyism scandal for Johnson. And
now the Mail, sorry, I got it wrong. It's the Mail have Dominic Cummings apparently saying is incompetent, blaming Carrie. We had a funny column, do you remember? by Otto English on Byline Times, a pastiche, What Carrie Did Next, and it was based on Rebecca. And she was like Rebecca in this mansion. There's this Mrs. Danvers, this scary figure who we made Dominic Cummings. So we kind of intuited a kind of tension between Dominic Cummings and Carrie. Maybe that's true. Or maybe these leaks, these fights, spats in number 10 are a distraction from the bigger issue. But to find out more, let's talk to Femi Olawole, who is a brilliant commentator on many things post-Brexit on Johnson. And Femi, can you hear me? Are you there?
Yeah, hi.
Hi. So what do you make of what's happened in the last few months with Boris Johnson, some of his gaffes for Mercury and the scandals for Mercury to cronyism and now the whole business with Dyson? What do you think's going on?
So it seems like the distraction strategy seems to be working quite well. I mean, for starters, we're somehow coincidentally focusing on David Cameron's lobbying scandal just when the lobbying scandals and the corruption scandals are coming up in relation to the current government. And now that it's hit Boris Johnson, suddenly Dominic Cummings is the story. The distraction technique seems to work quite well. And it is corruption. Now, when I saw the story about how he was sending texts to James Dyson saying, we'll fix the tax issue for you, I thought, okay, it was about getting PPE, it was about getting ventilators. We did need ventilators, we did need PPE, this sort of thing. I'd be willing to give them more benefit of the doubt if they'd done the right thing generally. Whereas, in fact, we know that there are issues about the, 180 million that went to Prosper Mill was the name of the company that made PPE that was not actually usable. Then there was the issue of the fact that James Dyson didn't end up supplying any ventilators. There's the fact that Transparency International a couple of days ago, or possibly yesterday, came out with a report that said that a significant portion of the contracts in terms of PPE went to people with close ties to the Conservative Party. The corruption is there.
So just to stop you there, we have Sam in the studio who's going to join us later. Yes, Sam, along with Byline Times and the Citizens, proved 1 billion in coronavirus contracts went to Conservative Party donors, 2 billion to Conservative Party associates.
Yeah, and ultimately the government is supposed to be serving us, the people, and they are not. And it is a caricature of the Conservative Party as being this posh, elitist club, and somehow they've managed to quite successfully brand themselves as caring about ordinary working people. But they don't. It's the same people behind austerity. It's the same people that gave that initial impression to begin with. They don't care. Boris Johnson, remember what he said about Liverpool fans after Hillsborough? He said that they like Liverpudlians like to see themselves as victims and they wallow in it. About working class people, he referred to them as aimless, drunk criminals. This isn't somebody who's a man of the people. This is somebody who went to Eton and has managed to clown his way, that's the persona he likes to take on, into power. And what I think some of the most offensive stuff we've seen recently has to be around the race reports. Because, so can you imagine, if you cast your mind back to last summer, you had the death of George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, and then thousands take to the streets in the middle of a pandemic here in the UK because they were so desperate to change things here. Now, we know that systemic racism exists here. We know that black people are stopped and searched by police 10 times more than white people. We know that Oxford research shows that if you've got a Nigerian-sounding name, you have to send 80% more job applications to get a job offer. We know that we have a curriculum that's significantly Anglo-centric, shall we say. That can be fixed. There are ways you can fix that. You can fix that with blind CVs. You can fix that with better rules around policing. And people wanted real change. And Boris Johnson went on TV and he said, it's my job as Prime Minister to change the narrative and stop this sense of victimization, which basically means I want to talk about it in a way that stops you talking about it as if you're a victim, rather than, here are some categoric things that are problematic. And so he went and spent 8 months to produce a report which ultimately says that, no, we don't have a problem with institutional racism. There's stuff that we can improve on, but ultimately this talk about racism is more divisive than the actual problem itself.
Well, I was going to ask Femi, hello, thanks for joining us, is that where sort of the culture war comes in? Because as you've said, the Conservatives, all of these allegations of cronyism and downright corruption, to be honest, at the heart of government, and yet the modern Conservative Party under Johnson is this kind of pro-Brexit, sunny future party of the working people, and we know that that's not necessarily the case in terms of the policies they're actually proposing. So is that where the culture war comes in? That actually the core support now is much more, in terms of the Conservative vote, is much more based on questions of identity as opposed to, economics or even policy itself?
Yeah, so that's often when I talk about the damage that is being done by the Conservatives, I try and emphasize that I mean Conservatives with a large C, because the Conservative Party stopped being conservative a long time ago. We used to be able to have conversations between people on the left and people on the right all right, we disagree, but at least we both want the best for the country. At least we both think we should improve people's lives. But conservative by definition, small c, should mean economic prudence, taking care of the economy. None of that is characterized by what we've seen over the last few years regarding Brexit. Deliberately going against what all of your experts are saying that will happen to the economy. So they've departed from that. Now it's about identity politics, and they've managed to very much split and weaponize the split between the economic left and right and the cultural social left and right. And they've managed to find people who otherwise would have been economically left, but who are actually more socially right, and bring them on board. And that's pretty much the strategy they've been using, and it's worked quite well.
I mean, one of the analogies for that, Femi, I think is what happened in Poland, and in Hungary to a certain extent, was the white, there was mainly white in Poland, but the working class element, mainly in the east of the country, was encouraged to vote for a right-wing party, Law and Justice, on the promise of goodies. A promise that'd be bigger state aid and a very anti-free market, exactly as you pointed out, sort of economically quite left-wing, if you like, but socially very right-wing. Now, I'm just wondering, with what's happened in America after the Chauvin verdict, President Joe Biden came out and said there is systemic racism in the US. Do you think this is sustainable, that we're both Europe, apart from Poland and Hungary, we're moving away from our European partners and, historically since the last war, our key ally, which is the US, at least in social terms?
I've always felt that Brexit would ultimately be self-defeating. Ultimately, if you lead a campaign that's largely based on supporting the working class, and it ultimately ends up harming the working class, and nobody has felt that more sharply than fishermen recently. We've seen what's happened with them coming down to Westminster, parking their trucks on Downing Street. Some of them are reported as saying we fear losing our homes. And yet Brexit, we spent 5 years specifically to help that industry. Ultimately, it's self-defeating. And so whilst Boris Johnson tries to go in this direction, ultimately his wings will be clipped. And he knows that he can't go too far down that route, because he knows that he will alienate all the people he needs to do trade deals with. And ultimately those trade deals will end up reflecting the reality of the market. So, for example, he would have loved to do a deal that's with the EU whereby it's completely free trade, blah, 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 with no ties to the EU's rules, and yet he signed up to a Brexit deal that does the exact opposite of what he promised on the tin. The very basic principle of Brexit was, we will break free from the EU's rule system so that we can make different laws that will make us more competitive than the EU. That was the core premise. Yet we've signed up to a Brexit deal that's specifically designed to make sure that we avoid a situation where the UK has a competitive advantage over the EU. So we've done a Brexit that does the exact opposite of what Brexit was supposed to do. So that's the reality hitting the promises. And so while Boris Johnson tries to go his own way, it will fail.
So, before you go, we just wanted, hopefully you can hear it or see it. If not, we'll tell you what. They say, our reporter Sam Bright went down to Uxbridge, Boris Johnson's constituency. And in our first segment we're going to show you is he went around asking people what they thought about the PPE scandal and cronyism. And their answers are quite interesting. Just bear with us a minute, Femi, and we'll listen to this.
Have you heard about the PPE procurement scandal, all these contracts going to Conservative Party donors or not?
Sorry, mate, I haven't.
No, you haven't heard it. I haven't heard about that on the news or anywhere.
No, sorry, I haven't.
No, don't worry about it. What do you sort of watch BBC News and any papers that you read in particular?
Yeah, I do sometimes. Yeah.
But nothing. You're not seeing anything from on that.
No.
So £1 billion worth of contracts during the pandemic have been given to firms owned by Conservative Party donors.
Yeah.
It's a lot. It's a lot of money.
Billion.
Contracts, the coronavirus contracts that have gone to his mates. Have you heard anything about that?
No.
Nothing about that.
No.
You know, £1 billion worth of public contracts during the pandemic have gone to firms that are owned by Conservative Party donors.
Oh, is it?
£1 billion. You not heard about that on the news?
No, not even.
No. Do you read about politics sort of anywhere in particular or nowhere at all?
I just see my daily news of BBC News.
Yeah. So the contracts during the pandemic that have been awarded to Conservative Party donors, people with close links to the Conservative Party, have you heard about that at all?
No.
Anything about the PPE procurement scandal and the cronyism that's gone on in government?
No.
You haven't heard about that? No. Not on the news, not registered.
PPE?
Yeah, like your masks. Yeah, like your masks and stuff.
What scandal?
So there you have it, at least in this first segment, and we've got a second one coming up in the second half of the show, and we'll talk with Sam Bright about that. A lot of people in Uxbridge, when asked about the PPE crisis and cronyism, hadn't heard about it, and when asked what TV, where they got their news from, they said sometimes the front page of the newspapers, but generally the BBC. Now, do you think that is a factor, Femi, in that there's not more uproar, and why he's still ahead in the polls?
I think the media has allowed the distraction tactics to work. So now we've moved on to the Dominic Cummings, where people are forgetting about the PPE scandal, and that's working quite effectively. And I am disappointed that we were in Uxbridge again and didn't manage to hear the phrase "filthy piece of toe rag." I missed that one.
And just finally, Femi, what's your take on what's happening with the official opposition and how issues around the Labour Party may well be feeding into Johnson's continued popularity?
So the polls haven't changed much since 2019, since the election. Labour got 32% of the votes, 31% of the seats. Ultimately, Labour is still divided, the left is still divided. That's the problem you have with the first past the post system. Anybody who's expecting Labour to suddenly leapfrog over the Tories before the next election is kidding themselves. That's not what's going to happen. The only chance of getting the Tories out of office is if Labour commits to delivering proportional representation within 12 months of taking office. That way they can form an electoral pact with the other parties whereby voters for those other parties like the Greens and Dems will know that if they vote for Labour in their constituency in a one-off election, then all future votes for the Lib Dems and Greens will actually count in all future elections via proportional representation. That way you get that majority, because the majority has voted for parties to the left of the Tories in all but 3 elections since the Second World War. There is a way to fix this. Labour, Keir Starmer just needs to do it.
Well, Femi, that is fascinating discussion. So let's get you back in a few weeks on the sofa here, get you back down from Birmingham or wherever you are, down to London. We can talk about electoral pacts, future. Thanks so much for joining us.
Look forward to it. Thank you.
Yeah, it was interesting what that last point by Femi on the Labour Party, Peter. And it was something I wanted to just really briefly pick up on from those of you who watched our show last week and Brian Cathcart. It may have just been in the Q&A section, or it may have been in the main part of the show. I can't quite remember.
You're not in the Q&A, that's because you're not paying your Patreon.
But Brian Cathcart was making the point that he sees this moment that we're at as a fundamentally different from anything that's come before. So his take was actually what we've been used to is a politics of inevitability, that it's inevitable that the Labour Party at some point will get back into power, Johnson will go, the Conservative Party will go back to becoming more traditionally conservative, and there's a cycle. And he said that he does not believe that inevitability is characteristic of the point we're at. And I think we talked after the show, Peter, and you had quite an interesting take on what Brian was saying in that regard, didn't you?
I can't remember, but I have lots of interesting takes. I think that's a subject, I think we have other programs coming out with Anthony Barnett, profound changes in the British state. But one of the things which is relevant to our next topic is that the newspapers are the government are the newspapers. We see a media convergence, a convergence of power between the punditocracy, between those Boris Johnson and Michael Gove were both journalists, and the papers are very close to them. But another reason is alerted to from those interviewees on the street in Uxbridge is they're not hearing the news. Now, a couple of weeks ago, our reporter Sam White, who's just about to join us, we're holding him back, he's raring to go, he interviewed renowned political operator Alistair Campbell about why Johnson was getting away with it.
I don't know if it's true that Johnson is reported once to have said that the reason he went from journalism to politics is because nobody ever built a statue to a journalist. Now, it sounds pretty on brand, but I wonder if he's ever noticed that if you go to the BBC, there's a statue of a journalist outside, and he's called George Orwell. And I wish that some of the people who work there and some of the people who work in politics these days understood why there's a statue of George Orwell there. It's because, actually, of some of the starkness and the wisdom of the warnings that his work put out there. What do we mean by Orwellian? Well, I would argue there's something a little bit Orwellian about a campaign in a referendum that wins on a pack of lies, and then after it's won, they can get a new pack of lies, and as a result of that, you can end up with something you said would never happen, called more red tape at the borders and a border in the Irish Sea.
So it's finally here, hot foot from Uxbridge with the team. It took the team 2 hours to get back. Welcome, Sam, to the studio. First time on Friday night in Byline.
And as a reward for Sam Bright's excellent investigations into the PPE scandal, which you definitely helped to uncover, we've given Sam his own special microphone. There you go, there's your reward, Sam.
Who needs a Pulitzer when you have one of these beauties? Yeah. So I appreciate it, thank you very much.
It was a slightly technical malfunction with one of these, actually, to be honest, but there's got to be Pulitzers on the way. So that clip with Alistair Campbell, just to summarise this, I mean, he seemed to be making this point that we live in a punditocracy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fascinating, Alistair Campbell's view, and if you read the write-up that I did of the interview on Byline Times, I sort of go into this in a bit more detail, that he's the ultimate operator, Alistair Campbell. You know, he was in the heart of government. He was, you know, previously he was a media, operator, the Mirror political editor. Yeah. And even he is incredibly despondent at the state of the establishment and the system and the order of things, that someone so embedded in the system is actually like thrown his arms up and said, no, it's like, it's all corrupt, it's all rubbish. Obviously that suits his particular persuasion currently, you know, he's very much anti-Johnson, he's anti-Brexit, but he's as despondent as we are, you know, as an organisation that likes to be outside the system. And I think it's quite telling, actually, the state that we're in.
I mean, he was in the mixed position 10 years ago. We'll have to celebrate that 10th anniversary very soon in July, when Leveson and the Millie Dallas scandal of phone hacking. I didn't know him. I met him once or twice briefly, but he was embedded, you know, in that old school journalism and believed, and he's completely lost that, hasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, he was very much singing the praises of new media as well, which was quite refreshing to hear. I don't know whether it was just because he was in our sofas and wanted to charm us. Well, no, fortunately not. And he was very generous with his time. But he was saying that the old guard, that the BBC, he implied heavily, and certainly the newspapers, of which he used to work for, just simply aren't holding the government to account currently. Which is something that we've banged on about repeatedly, and it's good that there are others in influential positions who agree.
One thing I want to pick up, because we have some social comment on this, is that, because he was talking about lies and had several comments, you know, why didn't we pick up the issue of the dodgy dossier and lies there? I don't know what his answer would have been. One of the interesting differences, I was thinking, this is 18 years ago now, and there was a public inquiry, the Chilcot inquiry. They were exposed as false information, the 40-minute warning, and there were no weapons of mass destruction, but they didn't fake them.
Yeah.
The one thing that could have done, I'm not saying Boris Johnson would fake weapons of mass destruction, but my person disagree, please do. There were a different order of lying here. They twisted the facts, they believed false intelligence as a feedback loop in America to justify going to war. But they did have a public inquiry, and they didn't fake weapons of mass destruction. Does this seem different to you guys?
I wouldn't say it's tremendously different. I think that Alistair is certainly not blameless in this, but we're fighting, if it is a war, we're fighting a new war now, and Alistair is not on the front line of it. We've got to hold those who are in power to account, and Alistair has proven himself to be extremely effective at that in recent years, and he has something very clear to say, and he's spoken at length about Iraq, and it was my view that, why focus on that when we can focus on Boris Johnson's wrongdoing, which is very much impacting the country right here and right now.
I think for me, when we talk about the Iraq War, I think what it did as an event in political life in Britain and the repercussions of it down the line was potentially deeper and more significant than maybe even at the time we realised. So I don't, I think it is a different order of things. I think
but
what
it's
the
the
Johnson,
same, it's a continuation.
No, I think the Johnson government is far, far worse. They don't open themselves up to any scrutiny whatsoever, which New Labour certainly did, for example, Tony Blair's government, Gordon Brown, etc. But there's complete impunity with the Johnson government. But what I think that the events like Iraq did, and the weapons of mass destruction, and all of this, dodgy, dirty dossiers and all that sort of thing, was it laid the groundwork for a perception in the wider public that actually politicians lie, and they all lie, and they do things that are immoral. And it began that degeneration, which I think has continued to the point now where we have this point about standards have dropped, our expectations perhaps of politicians have dropped so low that what Boris Johnson's doing now doesn't seem that outrageous, and it's a public health emergency. So at least he's doing something to help any of us.
And there is, Peter Kelman had made this point that, one of the reasons these scandals don't impact like Jim Major is our expectation that it's so low. And he cited, MPs' expenses. But you're right, 7 years earlier, that's another lowering of standards where, that's what we expect of our
Perhaps that's why the lobbying scandal is like, oh yeah, that's what they do. They spend money on their own expenses. That's what they do anyway. And it kind of gets blurred into this bigger problem, which is we just don't trust the political system. It doesn't speak to us, which I think is like a massive worry in a democracy.
And it's Labour's problem. I think that's what you were trying to prompt Peter on earlier as I was skulking in the backdrop. But this is Labour's problem, that they can't define themselves as something opposed to that because the public think they're all the same. That's sort of been the mantra, hasn't it, for years, that they're all the same. Even under Corbyn, they sort of shifted away from that slightly because he was seen as perhaps someone who was a bit more principled. But now there seems to be the return of they're all the same, they're all tarred with the same brush, which I find it interesting that Labour's still banging on the lobbying and the cronyism quite hard. I mean, Starmer mentioned it at PMQs. They clearly see that they might have an avenue there, but maybe that's because they don't have many others to work with at the minute.
Well, on that point, let's go to our second clip from your interviews today in Uxbridge, where you our first clip, by the way, showed people who hadn't heard about it, and that speaks to something about our media ecosystem, something which is dominating the news, according to us, in our echo chamber. But a lot of people had heard about it. Later on social media, we'll release a third clip, which will show very articulate reactions of outrage among people who had heard about it and what they thought of Boris Johnson. But here's the second category: people who heard about it and don't mind.
PPE, corruption, cronyism scandals.
could that be prevented? No. These kind of things.
So
I know we've got drugs, I know we've got everything's to combat things, but the simple plain fact, right? Think of the good thing he did. Good, right? Finding solutions.
PPE, corruption, cronyism scandals.
Yep, I've heard about it on the news, yeah.
Yeah, what have you heard about it?
I just think it's taken completely out of context in that all this happened when we were literally at war with the pandemic. So therefore I think when you're at war it's an extreme situation, so extreme measures need to be taken.
Yeah, so you'd back him? You'd back him to sort?
Absolutely, 100%.
What if I told you that £1 billion worth of contracts have gone to firms owned by Conservative Party donors? Does that change your mind?
No. There's probably £1 billion gone to Labour people as well, but you're not mentioning that.
No, there haven't.
Oh,
but
okay, that's convenient.
It is convenient when it's the party of government that's given the contracts.
Yeah, I'm sure whoever would be in government would do the same.
Yeah. Have you heard a lot about the PPE procurement scandal, cronyism, anything about that in the news?
Well, the media, it's a well-known thing, the media blow everything out of proportion. And you can't ever believe everything what the media says. You could have done anything else. And Labour have put him down until the cows come home. Right? It came out of nowhere. It's just like the plague. Could right with the rats? Could that be prevented? No. These kind of things. So I know we've got drugs. I know we've got everything's to combat things. But the simple plain fact, right? Think of the good thing he did. Good, right? Finding all these injections and all these vaccines, and look at India.
Well, sorry about the glitch at the beginning of that clip, and there's a bigger glitch in British society, it seems. And it goes back to a kind of famous phrase from the England football team supporters: nobody likes us. No, sorry, Millwall. Nobody likes us, and we don't care. So one thing that makes me reminds me of is Donald Trump. And we didn't come up with this phrase, but we quoted a phrase regularly on the front of our cover. Something lies in pseudo-populism. Pseudo-populism, a term coined by the great Professor Timothy Snyder, who wrote about Trump and Russian interference and various other, and also about the Holocaust. That there is a form of pseudo-populism where, he punishes us, he makes us feel small, we know he's ripping us off, but we don't mind. And kind of like being beaten up. Actually, Timothy Snyder made this amazing correlation between opioid addiction and Boris Trump votes. He actually correlated. Do you think, people always say I over-egg my comparisons of Boris Johnson and Donald Trump. Joe Biden says they're physical and emotional clones.
Yeah, and of course on Byline Times we refer to them as the rump Trumpocracy, which is your famous term, isn't it, Peter? It's one of my favourites that you've come up with, I have to say.
It's the inner rhyme, rump and Trump. But do you think that's fair? Ask you, Sam. What do you think Boris Johnson is rump? He's actually still playing the Bannon playbook, Steve Bannon, the Trump playbook, the divide and rule kind of white working class playbook.
Yeah, I think it is. I think in some ways it's even worse. Obviously what Trump said and did and tweeted was probably worse than what Boris does. But Boris seems more aware, and he's clearly better educated, more intelligent, and therefore there's he's doing this actively in a way that Trump, it just seemed that he slipped into it, he fell into it, he'd get power however he wanted, he just wanted the fame. Boris wants the fame, but also he knows the sort of lies and games that he has to play to get there.
He has a famous phrase, I think, I'm not sure it's true, you're never sure to what extent this is apocryphal or he's made it up on the spot, that one of the reasons he gave up journalism to become a politician was they don't erect statues to journalists. Yeah. But they do, but of course they do, as somebody pointed out, to George Orwell. Sorry, it's right. Alistair Campbell pointed that out to George Orwell. Do you think this analogy is fair? Do you agree with Sam? It's kind of worse.
I agree that there's an analogy between the era that America's just been through and what is happening here. But again, to go back to the New Labour era, I think it's a gradual presidential style of government which has crept in the UK. And in that presidential style, of course, in Britain, we have a parliamentary democracy and a constitutional monarchy. We don't have a president, the Queen is our head of state. America obviously does. But what's crept in over a number of years is this notion that the Prime Minister and the personality of the Prime Minister as the leader of the nation, that has become much more dominant, I think, in the public psyche. So I think one of the inexplicable appeals of Boris Johnson is that he, to a great many people, is a leader. He will say things that are kind of bombastic. He will stand up for Britain. Brexit's going to be great. We're going to rule the world again. And he provides people with a notion of what a leader should be standing up and doing. I also think a lot of it is a mythic sort of leadership. So in a world which is becoming increasingly, every day, more and more complex, random and disruptive things are happening all the time, I think people want simplicity. So even if they know that Johnson has many questionable traits, lying being one of them, I think at least they kind of know that, and at least they know they're going to have a leader who's going to tell them that Britain can be great again. I think that's the analogy with Trump. And I think that's that problem that we unpick. If you got to the stage where the public at large think all politicians are the same, don't like any of them, but if we're going to have someone, at least let's have Boris raising a pint and pretending he's one of us. I think it's going that way. I think that's annoying for people like us who believe in democracy and our parliamentary nature of our constitution. But I think it's become more presidential. I think personality is absolutely key. And I have to say, I think some of the issues around Keir Starmer, as we saw this confrontation with a pub landlord, I think just in the last week and a half, I don't know. It'd be interesting to see how Boris Johnson would have dealt with that.
I feel as though Labour in its current incarnation hasn't learnt the lessons actually of the Trump and the Boris Johnson playbook. They're going back to sort of a Blairite model of triangulation and saying things that don't offend people. But as we were talking about, the bar's been lowered, and so you've got to say anything to capture the media's attention, which is what Boris does. If you're like, even if the media's criticising you, as happened in 2016 with Trump, at least they're talking about your issues. You're dominating, the wall, the border wall. With Mexico as a classic example of Trump. He got harangued by the liberal media, but they were talking about the border wall. And so that reached his base, whereas Stan was very conservative in that way in his media strategy. And I think he could do with, applying those tactics, but, using progressive politics, embedding it within progressive politics.
And that's what we've seen, isn't it? So what did Margaret Thatcher say? Asked what her greatest achievement was after she left office, and she said it was Tony Blair, because we forced our opponents to change. New Labour sort of, whether we like it or not, accepted that the market forces and sort of free market economy was absolutely key. David Cameron was then accepting that Blair era of kind of being socially comfortable with things like gay marriage, and all these different things had to now be a mainstay in politics. And it's almost like, I think what Sam is saying is the modern left going to accept that whether they like it or not, populism and leadership and personality does matter?
Well, if you look back, and we were talking about this last week, how different this kind of conservatism is to, which I remember, too young to remember, the 80s and Thatcherite conservatism, for all its devastation it caused to post-industrial economies and what they did to the miners, what it did with Section 38, what it did to nationalism supporting Pinochet. There was a consistent ideology. Now, the alt-right, I'd say this is where the Bannon playbook does work for them. That alt-right ideology, and though it's not much reported, Bannon claims he gave Boris Johnson advice for his first speech.
So this is Steve Bannon.
Steve Bannon, Trump's campaign manager, co-founder of Cambridge Analytica, on that. And the hijab, this column he wrote about calling Muslim women making them look like bank robbers. Now, you can't triangulate around somebody who's already triangulating. That seems to... But the key difference, just finally on this, before we wrap up and have our Q&A, the difference is we're not in a presidential situation. And one small example of that is this ridiculous briefing room which contracted to a Russian company for 2.3 million. Was it 2.3 million?
Yeah, 2.6.
Yeah.
2.6.
Yeah.
They used it once, they can't use it anymore because it looks so ridiculous. Flags everywhere. They're closing it down, aren't they? They're going to use it for private briefings.
Yeah. I mean, the woman, so Allegra Stratton, who was hired to be the press secretary, has now been bumped off to head up the COP26 summit, and she's not going to be doing it anymore. And they would have paid her salary as well. Who's, I mean, interestingly on the media, her husband is James Forsyth, who's the political editor of The Spectator, who's been very effusive about Boris Johnson in recent weeks. So
I'm sure that's coincidence.
I'm sure it's a huge
never
coincidence.
talk about that ahead. So on that, just a purely visual level, you know, the White House briefing, all that glamour, the flags, doesn't quite wash here with the British public.
Yeah, and the president can't just dodge questions. You know, whatever we say about Donald Trump, he still used to go out there and hold these press conferences and open himself up to interviews. Johnson does the bare minimum.
So, but here's the second thing where we're different, especially with Conservative Prime Ministers. What's been the fate of three of the last four Conservative Prime Ministers? How have they left office?
They're bumped out by their own party.
Yeah, you can't do that in the American Constitution. So we have a kind of parliamentary system where you vote a party in. At a presidential image, but if the party doesn't want that president, they get rid of them. But we can't do that here.
Yeah. And I think that wing of the party it knows its power now. The DRG obviously got rid of Theresa May when it wanted to, and it's been flexing its muscles around COVID, which is, I think, in part why we've seen such devastation and the early relaxation of rules, because they know that they can tip their leader overboard whenever they choose.
The good news about that is there's always going to be infighting, and we'll be there to cover it. It's all kicking off this weekend by the look of the Mail and Dominic Cummings. But before we go, we'll just take a quick look at our front page, which is the rot.
Now the rot spreads.
This is our digital front page, not our monthly print edition. This is our weekly digital front page. And leading our front page this week, as so often happens, is Sam. Do you want to just take us quickly through the two stories, basically? You have, I think your key story was this commentary. You have a story about lobbying with the citizens of Byline Times T, but just very quickly that these three issues, there were 5 reasons, weren't they, why Boris Johnson didn't do the country fairly. Do you think this will cut through?
No, because of the media, but it's certainly, I think we have seen it amongst our audience, because I think there's been a sense, and the initial quote within the piece is, we did everything we could.
Yes.
And then I'm trying to rebut that notion, because that's something that press officers from the government have come back to us repeatedly, that we did everything we could. And we've seen it in one of our clips. You know, there's that perception that it's wartime, and so the government had to get in the trenches and, you know, act however it should to fix this. Whereas we've been pointing out for the past 12 months that has caused 150,000 people to die, that it's wasted billions of pounds on test and trace and PPE, that billions of pounds have gone to Tory donors and associates. And yeah, it's just getting that counter-narrative out there that isn't strongly filtered through the mainstream. That's kind of, I thought it was interesting that Laura Kuenssberg, in her piece about lobbying this week, in the Dyson piece that she revealed that Dyson was texting Boris Johnson, she compared the lobbying of charities of the government to multinational corporations, and there's a fundamental difference between those two things.
Saying, well, of course you're going to get lobbying in politics. Who would say it's wrong for a charity to contact an MP and raise awareness of its issues?
But they're looking at refugees in Eritrea, not for a tax boon or a way of breaking through tax. They can work here without paying
but
taxes.
As Sam says, why put that in?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, why?
Why
it
is
doesn't
that
make
analogous?
sense. It doesn't make sense. Like, more than anything with BBC coverage, I'm just sat there in a sort of intellectual desperation as to, like, why have they written certain things? And I used to be a BBC journalist, as the Mail on Sunday like to point out. Don't look at that article. But I'm just sat there and thinking, this just doesn't make logical sense, and it seems like political triangulation within the BBC as to like which parties they have to accommodate, and not fearlessly pursuing journalism regardless of the, you know.
It feels like a balance of interests, and you've got to have their line rather than exactly just telling the truth.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, we'll be here to tell more truths In about 10 minutes, we're going to crack open the beers, and well, not champagne, Coca-Cola, and we'll be here for Q&A. So do join us in about 10 minutes' time. If you sign up to patreon.com/Byline TV, we'll tell you all the things we can't say on live TV, just for you alone. And meanwhile, just thanks Sam coming in, and Hardy and I will see you next week.
Yeah, thank you. See you next week.